So there I was, deep in the bowels of the Galactic Military Academy's archives, when three of the most curious cadets in the known universe stumbled upon the classified file that would change everything. Well, change everything for them anyway. The rest of us already knew humans were weird. Zephyr, a blue-skinned Zentorian with more enthusiasm than sense, practically vibrated with excitement as his 6 eyes scanned the holographic display. Guys, look at this. His voice carried that particular pitch that suggested either a major discovery or a complete mental breakdown. With Zephyr, it was often both. Klaxon, the methodical insectoid from Hive Cluster Prime, clicked his mandibles in disapproval. His compound eyes processed information at roughly 3 times the speed of most species, which meant he was usually 3 times as annoyed by everyone else's slowness. Zephyr, your volume modulation is disturbing my data analysis algorithms. But this is huge. Zephyr bounced on his tentacle feet, pointing at the screen with all 4 of his arms. Look, classification level Omega, human military consultation, permanent banned status. The third member of their little investigation team, Boom Boom, looked up from the corner where he'd been trying to figure out if the archive's fire suppression system could be weaponized. Boom Boom was a Splodian, which meant he was roughly humanoid-shaped green, and had an unhealthy fascination with things that went boom. His people had evolved on a planet where everything exploded regularly, so they considered controlled detonations a form of art. Wait, Boom Boom gurgled, his voice carrying that wet quality common to amphibians who'd learned Galactic Standard as a second language. The humans are banned from war councils, but their combat record is perfect. They've never lost a single engagement. And that, my friends, was the million-credit question that had been puzzling military strategists for the better part of a century. Humans had participated in exactly 17 military conflicts since joining the Galactic Coalition, and they'd won every single one. Not just one, mind you, but one so decisively that their enemies typically surrendered before humans even finished warming up. Klaxon's antennae twitched as he processed the data. This is statistically improbable. Species with perfect combat records are traditionally elevated to strategic leadership positions. The Thoraxian swarm holds permanent seats on 12 different war councils due to their 97% victory rate. Maybe they're too good, Zephyr suggested, his excitement barely contained. Maybe the other species are jealous. Or maybe, Boom Boom added with the kind of gleeful speculation that made his instructors nervous, they've got some kind of super weapon that scares everyone else. The 3 cadets stared at the holographic file display, which showed nothing more than a red stamp reading access denied and a note that said see Admiral Fluffington for authorization. Below that, in smaller text, someone had added good luck with that. Now, you have to understand, these weren't just any cadets. These 3 had already gained a reputation for being, shall we say, persistently curious about things they probably shouldn't be curious about. Zephyr had once hacked into the Academy's meal planning system just to see if they could improve the nutritional content of the synthetic protein cubes. Klaxon had reorganized the entire tactical simulation database because the filing system offended his sense of order. And Boom Boom had been personally banned from 3 different chemistry labs after what the incident report carefully described as creative experimentation with volatile compounds. So we're doing this, right? Zephyr asked, though his tone suggested it wasn't really a question. Klaxon sighed, a sound that came out as a series of clicking noises. Define this. We're going to find out why humans are banned from war councils, Boom Boom declared, cracking his knuckles with a sound like bubble wrap popping. And we're going to do it the fun way. There's a fun way? Klaxon asked. There's always a fun way, Zephyr grinned, showing far too many teeth for most species' comfort. We just have to be creative. And that, dear listeners, was how 3 alien cadets accidentally stumbled into the most classified, most embarrassing, and most absolutely ridiculous military secret in the history of the Galactic Coalition. They had no idea what they were getting into, but then again, neither did anyone else when it came to humans. The file flickered once more on the screen, almost tauntingly, before the access denial message appeared again. But our intrepid trio had already made up their minds. They were going to solve this mystery, even if it killed them. Which, given what they were about to discover about humans, was actually a distinct possibility. The next morning found our 3 amateur investigators huddled around a terminal in the Academy's Historical Warfare Archive, which was basically a fancy name for the place where they stored all the old battle footage that nobody watched anymore. The archive smelled like dust, ozone, and the faint aroma of whatever species had been eating fermented algae cakes in there last week. Okay, so I may have borrowed Admiral Fluffington's access codes, Zephyr announced proudly, his tentacles dancing over the holographic interface. Klaxon's compound eyes whirred as they focused on his friend. Define borrowed. I observed him entering them during yesterday's tactical review, memorized the sequence, and I am now using them without his explicit permission. That's theft. That's resourcefulness. Boom Boom leaned back in his chair, which groaned under his weight. Look, we can debate ethics later. Right now I want to see some humans in action. I heard they once defeated an entire Krillian battle fleet, using nothing but mining equipment and what they called aggressive negotiations. The first video file they accessed showed a fairly standard space battle. Human ships, sleek and functional, engaged a much larger enemy fleet. The tactical display showed impossible odds, 20-to-1 enemy advantage, the kind of situation that military academies used as examples of when to execute strategic withdrawal. Watch this, Zephyr whispered, as if speaking too loudly might somehow alert the archive's security systems to their presence. On screen, the human fleet did something unexpected. Instead of retreating or forming defensive positions, they split up. Not into tactical formations, mind you, but into what appeared to be completely random directions. The enemy fleet, confused, tried to pursue all targets simultaneously. That's completely against standard tactical doctrine, Klaxon muttered, his mandibles clicking rapidly. They've eliminated any possibility of mutual support or coordinated defense. Then the humans did something even stranger. They started talking. Not just tactical communications, but casual conversation broadcast on all frequencies. The cadets listened in fascination as human pilots chatted about their breakfast, complained about their equipment, and made jokes about the enemy's ship designs. Are they mocking the enemy during combat? Boom Boom asked, sounding both impressed and horrified. The battle ended 12 minutes later with complete human victory. The enemy fleet had been so confused by the humans' apparent disregard for conventional tactics and their casual attitude toward mortal danger that they'd essentially defeated themselves, ships colliding as they tried to track targets that seemed to be following no logical pattern whatsoever. This is incredible, Zephyr breathed. They won by being completely unpredictable. The next file showed similar results. Humans defeating superior numbers through tactics that seemed to violate everything the cadets had learned about military strategy. They used cargo containers as improvised weapons, turned mining lasers into ship killers, and in one memorable engagement, defeated an enemy dreadnought by ramming it with a ship filled with what the battle report described as expired dairy products and industrial adhesive. But it was the post-battle interviews that really caught their attention. A human commander, still in his combat suit, was being interviewed by a Galactic Coalition news crew. He had that relaxed, almost sleepy expression that humans got after intense situations, and when asked about his tactical brilliance, he shrugged. Tactical brilliance? We just kind of made it up as we went along. Jerry over there suggested we try ramming them with the cheese ship, and it seemed like it might work, so we did it. The interviewer, a distinguished-looking reptilian with multiple degrees in military journalism, looked physically pained. But the complex maneuvering patterns the coordination required. Oh, that wasn't coordination, the human laughed. We were all just trying not to crash into each other. Sometimes it worked out, sometimes it didn't. This time it did. Klaxon paused the video. This human is suggesting that their victory was essentially accidental. No way, Boom Boom protested. Nobody accidentally defeats a dreadnought with expired cheese. But file after file showed the same pattern. Humans winning through what appeared to be chaos, improvisation, and a complete disregard for military protocol. Their success rate was perfect, but their methods made absolutely no sense to anyone, including apparently themselves. There's got to be more to this, Zephyr insisted, pulling up another file. Maybe the real answer is in the War Council records themselves. That's when they hit their first real roadblock. The War Council files weren't just classified, they were classified in 17 different ways, with security protocols that would make a paranoid artificial intelligence jealous. But buried in the access logs, they found something interesting. Look at this, Klaxon pointed to a series of timestamps. Human participation in war councils dropped off dramatically after year 2387. Before that, they were invited to every major strategic meeting. After that, nothing. What happened in 2387? Boom Boom wondered aloud. Zephyr's eyes gleamed with the kind of excitement that usually preceded either a major breakthrough or a major explosion. I think I know someone who might have been there. Professor Whiskers has been at this academy since before any of us were hatched, and he's got access to historical records that go way back. Professor Whiskers, for those unfamiliar with the faculty of the Galactic Military Academy, was an elderly Felinian who'd served in more conflicts than most species had words for. He was roughly cat-shaped, if cats grew to be 7 feet tall and developed an unhealthy obsession with military history. His office was legendary among cadets, not just for the smell of ancient documents and sardine-flavored protein supplements, but for the way he could make even the most boring historical lecture sound like the setup for an epic adventure. Professor Whiskers, Zephyr announced as they knocked on his office door, "We need to ask you about humans." The door opened to reveal the professor's ancient, whiskered face. His eyes, the color of old amber, fixed on each of them in turn. Then he did something none of them expected. He laughed. Then, Professor Whisker's office looked like a historical archive had exploded and then been organized by someone who understood the concept of filing systems but disagreed with them on philosophical grounds. Ancient battle maps covered every available wall space, sharing room with holographic displays showing famous engagements from the last 3 centuries. The smell was a mixture of old paper, electronic components, and what the professor insisted was vintage tuna flavor enhancer. But what most students suspected was just cat food. Humans, Professor Whiskers purred, settling into his chair with the careful movements of someone whose joints had been protesting daily activities for the better part of 2 centuries. You want to know about humans? Well. The 3 cadets arranged themselves in chairs that had probably been comfortable sometime during the previous millennium. Zephyr perched on the edge of his seat like he might need to flee at any moment. Klaxon sat with perfect posture, ready to analyze every word. Boom Boom sprawled out like he was attending a casual conversation instead of potentially uncovering classified military secrets. We've been researching their military record, Zephyr began carefully, and we noticed some inconsistencies in their status within the coalition command structure. Professor Whiskers twitched in what experienced students recognized as barely suppressed amusement. Inconsistencies. That's a diplomatic way to put it. He activated a holographic display that showed organizational charts of various coalition military commands. What you've noticed, young cadets, is that humans have been systematically excluded from strategic planning roles despite having a perfect combat record. But that doesn't make sense, Boom Boom protested. If they're perfect in battle, why wouldn't you want them planning battles? The professor's laugh was a rumbling purr that seemed to come from somewhere deep in his chest. Oh, my explosive young friend, that assumes that being good at fighting and being good at planning fights are the same thing. With humans, that assumption will get you into more trouble than a splodion in a fireworks factory. Klaxon leaned forward, his analytical mind latching onto the professor's words. Are you suggesting that human combat effectiveness and their strategic planning abilities are inversely related? I'm suggesting, Professor Whiskers said, pulling up another display, that human combat effectiveness comes from their complete inability to follow strategic plans, including their own. The display showed battle footage the cadets hadn't seen before. This one was from the human perspective, inside the cockpit of a fighter ship during what appeared to be a major engagement. The pilot was humming. Not just humming, but humming what sounded like a song about someone named Danny and his questionable life choices, while simultaneously performing maneuvers that should have been impossible in a ship that size. Listen to the communications, Professor Whiskers instructed. The cadets listened as human pilots chattered back and forth during what was clearly a life or death situation. They discussed their weekend plans, debated the merits of different sandwich combinations, and offered running commentary on their enemy ship designs that ranged from professional critique to what could only be described as creative insults. Blue leader, you've got 3 bogeys on your 6. Copy that, red 5. Also, do you think the Krillians designed their ships to look like angry kitchen appliances on purpose, or is that just an unfortunate coincidence? I'm thinking unfortunate coincidence, but we should ask them after we blow them up. Solid plan. Hey, anyone want to grab pizza after this? The battle ended with decisive human victory, naturally, but the cadets were staring at the screen in something approaching horror. They were discussing food while people were shooting at them, Claxon said slowly. They were critiquing enemy ship aesthetics during combat, Zephyr added. They were planning a post-battle meal while actively engaged in battle, Boom Boom finished, and he sounded almost reverent. Professor Whiskers nodded sagely. Now you're beginning to understand the problem. Humans treat warfare like it's just another day at the office. They don't get intimidated, they don't get scared in the traditional sense, and they absolutely refuse to take anything seriously for more than about 15 minutes at a time. He pulled up another file, this one showing a meeting room full of various coalition species. The timestamp indicated it was from 2386, just before humans disappeared from war councils. This is a strategic planning session for the Andromedan campaign, the professor explained. Watch the human representative. On screen, a human woman sat at a conference table surrounded by some of the most distinguished military minds in the galaxy. Admiral Tentacles of the Cephalopod Empire was there, his 8 arms manipulating holographic battle displays with precision that would make a quantum computer jealous. General Buzzsaw, the legendary mantoid warrior, sat perfectly still, his blade arms folded in contemplation. The Crystalline Collective's war mind sparkled with intense mathematical calculations. And in the middle of all this military brilliance sat Commander Patricia Pat Murphy, who appeared to be building a small sculpture out of the complimentary snacks. As you can see from these projections, Admiral Tentacles was saying, his voice carrying the weight of centuries of naval tradition, the enemy has established defensive positions that will require a 3-pronged assault involving coordinated strikes from 17 different fleet groups. Commander Murphy raised her hand. Question. Yes, Commander? Maybe. Why don't we just ask them to move? The room fell silent. Admiral Tentacles' tentacles stopped moving. General Buzzsaw's antennae twitched. The Crystalline Collective's harmonics shifted to what could only be described as confused. I'm sorry, Commander, could you clarify? Well, Pat said, absently adding another cracker to her snack sculpture. Before we start shooting at each other and making a big mess, why don't we just send them a message asking if they'd mind relocating to somewhere less strategically important? Maybe offer them a nice planet in a quieter sector. The silence stretched on for what felt like geological ages. Commander Murphy, Admiral Tentacles said carefully, That's not how war works. Says who? Professor Whiskers paused the recording. And that, my curious students, is why humans were eventually banned from war councils. Not because they couldn't fight, but because they couldn't understand why fighting was supposed to be taken seriously. The three cadets stared at the frozen image of Commander Murphy, who looked perfectly content with her cracker architecture while surrounded by the galaxy's most fearsome military leaders. But did her plan work? Zephyr asked. Professor Whisker's grin showed far too many teeth. That's the best part. They tried it, and the enemy was so confused by the request that they actually agreed to relocate to a different sector. The Andromedan campaign ended with 0 casualties and a very polite exchange of diplomatic notes. That's brilliant, Boom Boom breathed. That's terrifying, Klaxon corrected. They ended a war by simply asking nicely. They ended a war by refusing to accept that wars had to be complicated, Professor Whiskers clarified. And that, young cadets, is exactly why the coalition brass decided that humans were too dangerous to have around strategic planning sessions. The professor leaned back in his chair, looking remarkably pleased with himself. Of course, that's just one example. If you really want to understand why humans were banned, you'd have to talk to someone who was actually there during the worst of it. The worst of it? Zephyr squeaked. Oh yes, Professor Whiskers purred. Commander Murphy was actually one of the more conventional human representatives. Wait until you hear about the great pun incident of Sector 7. Finding Captain Tentacles hadn't been difficult. The elderly cephalopod spent most of his retirement in the Academy's aquatic wing, maintaining a small garden of sentient seaweed and writing his memoirs. What had been difficult was convincing him to see them. Absolutely not, came the muffled response from behind his habitat's security door. I know what you're here about, and I am not discussing it. Go away. Zephyr pressed his face against the reinforced transparent aluminum. Captain, we just want to understand why humans were excluded from military planning. Surely there's no harm in discussing historical events. Historical events? Captain Tentacle's voice rose to a pitch that made the water in his habitat vibrate. Historical events don't give you PTSD flashbacks every time someone mentions the word pun. The three cadets exchanged glances. Boom Boom stepped forward, his amphibious nature making him the most comfortable with the aquatic environment. Captain, we've seen the battle records. Humans have a perfect combat record. They've never lost a single engagement. How dangerous could their planning meetings have been? There was a long pause, broken only by the sound of water recycling systems and what might have been muffled sobbing. You want to know? Captain Tentacles finally said. You really want to know? Fine. But don't say I didn't warn you. The security door slid open, revealing a spacious aquatic habitat that looked like someone had combined a military command center with a very expensive aquarium. Captain Tentacles floated in the center, his 8 arms moving in patterns that spoke of barely controlled agitation. His skin shifted through colors that even the translation matrix couldn't quite interpret, though profound irritation mixed with lingering trauma seemed to be the general theme. I served with humans for 3 years, he began, his voice carrying the weight of someone recounting a natural disaster. 3 years of watching them turn military strategy into performance art. Do you know what it's like to spend 6 hours planning a complex orbital assault, only to have a human suggest that we just wing it and see what happens? Klaxon's mandibles clicked thoughtfully. But their improvisation proved effective in combat situations. Effective? Captain Tentacle's skin flashed a color that the translator rendered as, "Are you kidding me right now?" Yes, their improvisation was effective. That wasn't the problem. The problem was that they couldn't turn it off. Ever. Been doing. He activated a holographic display showing what appeared to be a formal military briefing room. The timestamp read 2387, and the cadets recognized it as one of the last war councils to include human representatives. This is the Rigel sector crisis, Captain Tentacles explained. Pirates had taken control of a major shipping lane, and we needed to coordinate a response involving 12 different species fleets. The humans sent Captain Jake Morrison as their representative. On screen, they could see the briefing room filled with the Coalition's finest military minds. Admiral Sparkles of the Crystalline Collective cast geometric patterns of light as she presented tactical analysis. General Thorax's chittering provided mathematical probabilities that would make a computer weep with envy. And in the middle of it all sat Captain Jake Morrison, who appeared to be trying to balance a stylus on his nose. The meeting had been going on for approximately 2 hours, Captain Tentacles continued, his tentacles writhing in remembered frustration. We had developed a comprehensive strategy involving coordinated hyperspace jumps, synchronized attacks, and complex communications protocols. It was a masterpiece of military planning. What went wrong? Zephyr asked, though he had a sinking feeling he already knew. Captain Morrison raised his hand and said, "Hey, what if we just told the pirates that we're pizza delivery guys?" The room fell silent. Even the water recycling system seemed to pause in respect for the magnitude of the statement. "Pizza delivery guys?" Boom Boom repeated slowly. "Pizza delivery guys," Captain Tentacles confirmed. His reasoning, and I'm quoting directly from the meeting transcript here, was that nobody shoots at pizza delivery guys because then you don't get your pizza. And everybody wants pizza. The holographic display shifted to show the reactions of the assembled military leaders. It was like watching a slow-motion catastrophe unfold. Admiral Sparkle's geometric patterns became increasingly chaotic. General Thorax's chittering reached frequencies that were probably illegal in several systems. And Captain Tentacles himself appeared to be questioning his life choices. But here's the thing, Captain Tentacles said, his voice taking on the tone of someone confessing to a terrible crime. It worked. We disguised our ships as pizza delivery vessels, approached the pirates, and when they opened their airlocks expecting food, we delivered justice instead of pepperoni. "That's genius," Boom Boom whispered. "That's not the point." Captain Tentacles exploded, his skin cycling through colors that definitely weren't in the standard translation database. "The point is that we spent months training our finest strategic minds to think like pizza delivery personnel. Do you have any idea what that does to military discipline?" Klaxon processed this information with the methodical thoroughness of his species. So the human strategy was successful, but it had negative effects on Coalition military culture. Negative effects? Captain Tentacles laughed, a sound like water being forced through a very small tube. After that mission, every military briefing devolved into brainstorming sessions about food service analogies. We had admirals suggesting we disguise dreadnoughts as ice cream trucks. Generals wanted to name battle formations after sandwich types. The entire command structure became obsessed with the strategic applications of casual commerce. The display changed again, showing what appeared to be a series of increasingly bizarre military proposals. The cadets watched in fascination as distinguished officers presented plans for disguising battle fleets as traveling circuses, mobile libraries, and door-to-door vacuum cleaner sales operations. The humans started every meeting by asking if anyone had thought of any fun new approaches, Captain Tentacles continued. They treated the most serious military crises like puzzle games. And the worst part was, their suggestions kept working. So why was that a problem? Zephyr asked, if their methods were effective. Because, Captain Tentacles said, his tentacles forming what could only be described as an expression of existential despair. Military command requires a certain level of dignity. When your most elite strategic planners are debating whether to use the flower delivery gambit or the singing telegram maneuver, you start to lose credibility with your enemies. The display showed a final meeting, apparently the last war council, to include human participation. Captain Morrison was there again, along with 2 other human representatives. They appeared to be playing some sort of hand-slapping game while Admiral Tentacles tried to explain the strategic importance of maintaining control over the Vega trade routes. And that's when it happened, Captain Tentacles said, his voice dropping to a whisper. The incident that ended human participation in war councils forever. What happened? All three cadets asked simultaneously. Captain Tentacle's skin shifted to a color that the translator could only render as profound traumatic memory. Captain Morrison looked directly at me, in front of the entire assembled coalition command structure, and said, "Hey, Captain Tentacles, why don't we just tell the enemy that we're having a crackin' good time planning this mission?" The silence that followed was the kind of silence usually reserved for the moments after catastrophic explosions or right before them. "He made a pun," Claxon said slowly. "He made a pun during the most important strategic planning session in coalition history," Captain Tentacles confirmed. And then the other humans started laughing. And then they started making more puns. Admiral Sparkles began making geometric patterns that translated to "please make it stop." General Thorax's chittering reached frequencies that shattered 3 coffee cups. And I had what the medical staff politely called a stress-induced chromatic episode. "What's a chromatic episode?" Boom Boom asked. I turned every color in my species' emotional spectrum simultaneously while screaming about the strategic applications of seafood jokes. The 3 cadets stared at the old cephalopod with something approaching awe. That's when the coalition leadership decided that humans were too psychologically damaging to include in military planning, Captain Tentacles concluded. Not because they couldn't fight. Not because their strategies didn't work. But because they treated warfare like it was supposed to be entertaining. After leaving Captain Tentacles to recover from his traumatic recollections, the 3 cadets found themselves in the Academy's most secure archive facility. This wasn't the dusty historical wing where they'd started their investigation. This was the kind of place where information went to be forgotten, protected by security systems that would make a bank vault jealous, and staffed by librarians who'd taken vows of silence so serious they communicated entirely through disapproving facial expressions. "I can't believe we're actually doing this," Claxon muttered, his compound eyes tracking the security sensors that followed their every movement. Zephyr's tentacles moved across the access panel with the kind of desperate enthusiasm that suggested he was either about to make a major breakthrough or a major mistake. Professor Whiskers said the final recordings were stored in Archive Vault Omega. Maximum security, maximum classification. Maximum, please don't let the general public see this or we'll all die of embarrassment. "How did you get access codes for a maximum security vault?" Boom Boom asked, though his tone suggested he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. "Remember when I said I borrowed Admiral Fluffington's access codes? Well, I may have also borrowed Admiral Tentacle's codes, Professor Whiskers' codes, and the access credentials of approximately 7 other senior faculty members." "That's not borrowing," Claxon pointed out. "That's a career-ending security breach." "Only if we get caught," Zephyr replied cheerfully, as the vault door slid open with a sound like the universe sighing in resignation. The archive vault was smaller than they'd expected, containing only a single holographic display terminal and what appeared to be the most advanced data storage system any of them had ever seen. The walls were lined with quantum storage matrices that hummed with barely contained information, and the air itself seemed to vibrate with the weight of classified secrets. "There," Zephyr said, pointing to a file marked with security warnings in 17 different languages. "The final Human War Council. The one that ended it all." The file's classification level was beyond anything they'd seen. This wasn't just classified, it was classified in ways that suggested the information inside might be dangerous to one's sanity, career prospects, and faith in the basic competence of military leadership. "Are we sure about this?" Claxon asked, his analytical mind finally catching up with the magnitude of what they were about to uncover. "We've come this far," Boom Boom said, though his usual enthusiasm for explosive revelations seemed somewhat muted. Besides, how bad could it be? Famous last words, as they say. The holographic display activated, showing a conference room that was clearly the Coalition's most prestigious military planning facility. Every seat was occupied by the finest strategic minds in known space. Admiral Tentacles was there, looking younger and significantly less traumatized. General Buzzsaw maintained his legendary stillness. The crystalline collective's war mind cast patterns of light that spoke of intense concentration. Even the enigmatic Shadow Council had sent a representative, though it was impossible to tell what they looked like or if they were actually there at all. And at the head of the table sat 3 humans. "Oh no," Claxon whispered, his mandibles clicking in recognition of impending disaster. The first human was Commander Patricia Murphy, whom they'd seen in Professor Whisker's files. The second was Captain Jake Morrison from Captain Tentacle's traumatic recollections. And the third was someone new, Colonel Marcus Mack Henderson, whose personnel file described him as dangerously creative and not to be left unsupervised near strategic planning equipment. "This is War Council Session 4847, Admiral Tentacles was saying on the recording, his tentacles moving in patterns of barely controlled optimism. "We are here to finalize strategy for the Centauri Liberation Campaign, which represents our most significant military undertaking in coalition history. The enemy was the hegemony of terrible doom, which was exactly as unpleasant as it sounded. They'd conquered 17 star systems, enslaved countless populations, and had a military doctrine based entirely on making everything as grim and hopeless as possible. Their ships were black, their uniforms were black, their propaganda was black, and according to intelligence reports, they'd even painted their planets black just to maintain thematic consistency. The hegemony has established defensive positions that are essentially impregnable," General Buzzsaw chittered. "Their fortress worlds are protected by overlapping shield generators, automated defense platforms, and psychological warfare systems designed to crush the morale of attacking forces before they even enter the system. The crystalline collective's representative cast geometric patterns that translated to increasingly complex mathematical proofs of why the mission was essentially impossible. The Shadow Council's representative said nothing, but somehow managed to project an aura of profound pessimism. And then Colonel Henderson raised his hand. "Question," he said, in the tone of someone who was about to suggest something that would either save the galaxy or destroy it. "Yes, Colonel." "Has anyone considered the possibility that these guys might just be really, really sad?" The silence that followed was the kind of silence typically associated with the heat death of the universe. "I'm sorry, Colonel. Could you elaborate?" "Well," Max said, leaning back in his chair with the casual confidence of someone who'd never met a military protocol he couldn't ignore. "Think about it. They call themselves the hegemony of terrible doom. Their ships are all black. Their planets are black. Their entire aesthetic is basically everything is hopeless and nothing matters. That's not evil, that's depression." Commander Murphy nodded thoughtfully. "Max got a point. I mean, when I'm feeling down, I tend to wear all black and listen to sad music and complain about how unfair everything is." "Are you suggesting," Admiral Tentacles said slowly, his tentacles beginning to twitch in ways that suggested this conversation was not going in a direction he was prepared for, but that the galaxy's most feared military force is suffering from a collective mental health crisis? "I'm suggesting," Captain Morrison chimed in, "that maybe instead of shooting at them, we should send them a care package and ask if they want to talk about their feelings." The 3 cadets watching the recording exchanged glances that conveyed everything from admiration to horror to the kind of existential confusion that comes from realizing your entire understanding of reality might be fundamentally flawed. "You want to send a care package," General Buzzsaw said, his voice carrying the mechanical precision of someone whose worldview was actively collapsing, but to the hegemony of terrible doom. "Why not?" Colonel Henderson asked. "Some cookies, maybe some uplifting music, a few greeting cards with encouraging messages. Show them that somebody cares." "And if that doesn't work," Commander Murphy added, "we could always try the pizza delivery thing again." What happened next could only be described as the complete and total breakdown of military discipline at the highest levels of coalition command. Admiral Tentacles began cycling through colors that probably didn't exist in normal space. General Buzzsaw's chittering reached frequencies that caused 3 different recording devices to shut down in self-defense. The crystalline collective's representative started casting geometric patterns that looked suspiciously like screaming faces. But the humans weren't done. Oh, Captain Morrison said, bouncing in his chair like an excited child. What if we disguise the care packages as invasion fleets? So they open their shields expecting a battle, but instead they get cookies and encouragement. And friendship bracelets, Colonel Henderson added. Everyone loves friendship bracelets. We could include a playlist, Commander Murphy suggested. Something upbeat. Maybe some Earth classic rock, some Centaurian jazz fusion, definitely some of those Andromedan healing chants. At this point, the Shadow Council representative did something unprecedented. They became visible just long enough to put their head in their hands. In cards. Captain Morrison continued, apparently oblivious to the psychological breakdown occurring around him. Handwritten cards with personalized messages. Hey, we noticed you've been conquering star systems lately, and we just wanted you to know that we're here if you need to talk. The recording showed Admiral Tentacles at the exact moment his sanity finally gave up and decided to take a permanent vacation. His tentacles went completely still, his skin shifted to a color that the translation matrix rendered as existential void. And he began speaking in what could only be described as the voice of someone whose entire understanding of warfare had just been replaced with the cosmic certainty that nothing made sense anymore. You want, Admiral Tentacles said slowly, to defeat the galaxy's most feared military empire with emotional support. Well, when you put it like that, it sounds silly, Colonel Henderson replied. But think about it logically. What's the one thing that an empire built on doom and despair would never expect? Military competence? General Buzzsaw suggested weakly. Kindness, all three humans said simultaneously, as if they'd rehearsed this moment. And that, dear listeners, was when the recording captured the exact moment that the coalition's military leadership collectively decided that humans were too psychologically dangerous to be allowed within 100 parsecs of strategic planning. The meeting devolved from there into what could only be described as chaos with good intentions. The humans began brainstorming care package contents with the same enthusiasm they'd previously applied to military tactics. Someone mentioned including SPA certificates. Commander Murphy suggested adding a book club selection. Captain Morrison wondered if they should include instructions for meditation techniques. Meanwhile, the assembled military leadership of the known galaxies slowly descended into various species-specific forms of catatonic shock. The best part, Colonel Henderson said, apparently unaware that he was presiding over the complete collapse of military protocol, is that this approach has a much better cost-benefit ratio than traditional warfare. Think about how much money we'll save on ammunition. The recording ended with Admiral Tentacles slowly sinking beneath his desk, General Buzzsaw's chittering becoming a barely audible whisper of what have we become, and the crystalline collective's representative casting geometric patterns that looked like abstract representations of screaming. The three cadets sat in the archive vault, staring at the darkened display in something approaching religious awe. They tried to end a galactic war, Zephyr said slowly, with care packages and emotional support. And it worked, Boom Boom added in wonder. The mission files show that the hegemony of terrible doom surrendered 3 weeks later and renamed themselves the Collective of Moderate Optimism. Klaxon's analytical mind was struggling to process the implications. They defeated the galaxy's most feared enemy by being nice to them? Not just nice, Zephyr corrected. They refused to accept that their enemies had to be enemies. They treated warfare like it was a misunderstanding that could be resolved with sufficient kindness and baked goods. The three cadets sat in Professor Whisker's office once again, this time with the weight of cosmic truth pressing down on them like a particularly heavy and embarrassing blanket. The professor had prepared tea, which was thoughtful, though none of them seemed particularly interested in drinking it. They were too busy processing the revelation that the galaxy's most perfect military force had been banned from strategic planning because they kept treating war like a social work opportunity. So Professor Whiskers said, his whiskers twitching with barely contained amusement, "I take it you found what you were looking for." "We found something," Klaxon replied, his compound eyes still processing the implications. Though I'm not entirely sure it's what we expected to find. The humans weren't banned because they were too violent, Zephyr said slowly. They were banned because they weren't violent enough. They were banned, Boom Boom corrected, because they kept making everyone else question why they were being violent in the first place. Professor Whiskers nodded sagely. And that, my young investigators, is why the truth has been classified for the past century. Can you imagine what would happen if the general population discovered that the galaxy's most feared enemies could be defeated with care packages and friendship bracelets? Military recruitment would probably drop significantly, Klaxon observed. Military recruitment would become obsolete, Professor Whiskers corrected. Why train soldiers when you can train social workers? Why build weapons when you can build gift baskets? The entire military-industrial complex of the galaxy would collapse overnight if everyone knew that most conflicts could be resolved by asking, "Are you okay?" and actually listening to the answer. The implications were staggering. The cadets realized they were sitting on information that could fundamentally change how the galaxy approached interspecies conflict. And they also realized that they absolutely positively could not tell anyone about it. The humans knew, didn't they? Zephyr asked. They knew this would happen. Professor Whiskers activated his display one final time, showing a classified addendum to the human exclusion order. It was a message from the human government to the coalition leadership, dated shortly after their ban from war councils. Dear coalition friends. The message read, "We understand your decision to exclude us from military planning, and honestly, we're kind of relieved. War councils were cutting into our recreational time, and we've got this new pizza recipe we've been wanting to try. Also, we've started a galaxy-wide delivery service. If you ever need anything dropped off anywhere in known space, just let us know. We do same-day delivery for most systems, and our customer satisfaction rating is phenomenal. Thanks for understanding. Love, the humans. P.S. We left some cookies in your break room." The three cadets stared at the message in wonder. They weren't upset about being excluded, Boom Boom said. They were happy about it. They got exactly what they wanted, Klaxon realized. They proved their point about alternative conflict resolution, and then they got to go do something they actually enjoyed. And now they run the most successful delivery service in the galaxy, Professor Whiskers added. Human Express Delivery has a 99.8% customer satisfaction rating and has never missed a delivery deadline. They treat package delivery with the same creative enthusiasm they used to apply to military strategy. So they're happier, Zephyr mused. The coalition leadership is less traumatized, and conflicts still get resolved, just with less psychological damage to senior command staff. Everyone wins, Professor Whiskers agreed. Which is, when you think about it, the most human outcome possible. The professor leaned back in his chair, looking remarkably pleased with the way the conversation had developed. Of course, this does raise the question of what you three are going to do with this information. The cadets exchanged glances. They'd started this investigation hoping to uncover some dramatic military secret, possibly involving secret weapons or hidden tactical advantages. Instead, they'd discovered that the galaxy's most effective military force had been excluded from strategic planning because they kept trying to solve problems with kindness, and they'd been perfectly happy about the whole arrangement. "We keep it secret," Klaxon said finally. "The galaxy isn't ready for this level of humanity." "The military establishment would collapse," Zephyr added. "And while that might not be entirely bad, the transition period would probably be chaotic." Plus, Boom Boom concluded, the humans seemed perfectly content running their delivery service. Why mess with a good thing? Professor Whiskers purred his approval. Wise decision. Though I suspect that someday when the galaxy is ready, this information will become public knowledge. And when that day comes, we might find that the humans were ahead of their time in more ways than one. As the three cadets prepared to leave, Professor Whiskers called after them. "Oh, and cadets, If you're ever in need of anything delivered anywhere in the galaxy, I highly recommend Human Express Delivery. They're remarkably efficient, surprisingly affordable, and they always include a handwritten note thanking you for your business. Walking back through the academy corridors, the three friends found themselves looking at their fellow cadets with new perspective. All around them, students from dozens of species were training to become military leaders, learning tactics and strategy, and the proper protocols for interspecies warfare. And somewhere out there, humans were delivering pizza and asking if everyone was having a nice day. You know, Zephyr said thoughtfully, I think I understand why the humans have a perfect military record. Because they're unpredictable? Klaxon guessed. Because they're creative? Boom Boom suggested. Because they refuse to accept that problems have to be solved the hard way, Zephyr replied. They look at every situation and ask, what if we just tried being nice? And apparently most of the time that actually works. The three cadets reached their dormitory, each carrying the weight of a secret that could change the galaxy. They'd set out to discover why humans were barred from war councils, and they'd found something far more significant, proof that the most powerful weapon in the universe might just be the willingness to treat your enemies like people who are having a bad day. And somewhere in the delivery routes between star systems, humans continued to demonstrate that the most effective way to win a conflict is to refuse to treat it like a conflict in the first place. The galaxy, it seemed, was in very good hands. Even if those hands were usually holding pizza boxes and friendship bracelets instead of weapons. The secret would remain safe with them, filed away alongside all the other classified information that cadets weren't supposed to know. But sometimes, late at night, each of them would smile at the thought that the most feared and respected military force in galactic history had been gently excluded from strategic planning because they kept suggesting that maybe everyone should just try getting along better. And in a universe full of war and conflict and species who took themselves very seriously indeed, that might just be the most human thing of all.